So, for example, 1,000 years ago, let's take the year 1000 as a point. The Muslim world was part of the first world with China, and possibly you could argue, although it was already fading, Eastern Christianity in Constantinople. By and large, the Arab world was a new member of the first world and a particularly vigorous member of the first world. The Arab world and more broadly the Muslim world, which was largely dominated by Arabs. So here you have a situation where Islam in its early period is enormously successful on a global scale, literally unseen by any movement before. And as a result, they were extremely proud of their tradition, and they developed a number of notions that built up that pride, including the way they treated conquered peoples. If they were idol worshippers, then they would be killed. If they were Christians or Jews, then they had what's called the status of dhimmi, spelled D-H-I-M-M-I, which literally means blameworthy, and they're blameworthy because they haven't accepted Islam, but is often translated today as protected. But you have to understand that's protected in the sense of a protection racket. In other words, as long as they accepted their status as inferior, as long as they accepted a fair number of shameful practices and statuses that were attributed to them, including the inability to ride on horses, they had to ride on donkeys, they couldn't build their churches and their synagogues higher than mosques, and so on. All of these are classic concerns of honor and shame. As long as they accepted their position, they were protected. What were they protected from? They were protected from the violence of Muslims. So I wouldn't quite call it a protected status, but okay, that's how many people refer to it. So they developed this notion of the dhimmi. They also developed this notion of Dar al-Islam, Dar al-Harb, Dar al-Islam being the realm of Islam, which is where Sharia rules, which is not the realm of peace, but the realm of submission. Granted, peace is one of the products of submission, but certainly not the kind of peace that we think of in terms of peace and freedom. And Dar al-Harb is the realm of the sword, and that's everywhere where infidels live not subject to the law of Sharia, not subject to Muslim law. And that means obviously the entire Christian world, and indeed all of the world that hadn't already been conquered by Islam. So we infidels who live in Dar al-Harb are in fact, the term for us in Islam is not just infidel, but also harbi. Kharev is the Hebrew word for sword. Harbi means that we are those who are destined to the sword. So Islam, as part of its notion of itself as great and powerful and the only right, pure religious belief on the planet, has developed a whole set of attitudes towards the non-Muslim other, which are profoundly derogatory. Any term, infidel, actually the term kufar means he who conceals, who conceals the truth. And as I said, dhimmi means blameworthy. So the attitude of Muslims towards non-Muslims is historically profoundly negative and profoundly hostile. This idea of, Dar al-Islam, Dar al-Harb is in some senses a translation into religious language of a classic tribal, honor-shame, clan-based, solidarity-based attitude, which is our side right or wrong. So as a result, you have these powerful elements within Islam that, under conditions of modernity, are in crisis. And, what happened was that over time, the Muslims eventually conquered Constantinople in 1453, I believe, 1453, they conquered Constantinople. They then came into the Balkans. They got as far as the gates of Vienna. Previously, they had conquered in Western Europe almost up to France, but that was centuries earlier, and they were pushed back. So interestingly enough, 1453, they take Eastern Christianity. 1492, the Christians, the Catholics in Spain, kick them out of their last hold in Europe. And that victory on both sides, their victory was against the weaker part of Christianity. The stronger part of Christianity, which was the Western part, was on the rise. So ironically, in the year 1000, when Islam is part of the first world, Western Europe is at the bottom of the third world. This is a culture that is basically still a tribal culture. Its exports are not the exports of manufacture. Its exports are primary goods, whether it's wood or precious metals or other primary materials, including humans. The very term slave comes from Slav because the Christians were going into the pagan Northeast, into areas of the Slavic areas, and taking these blonde people down to the Mediterranean and selling them to the Muslims. Muslims like white slaves. So as a result, our term, I mean, the Latin term for a slave is servus, and we get serf from that. But the word slave literally comes from this period where Europe was at the bottom of the third world and exporting even human raw material rather than anything manufactured. And then in the course of this last millennium, from 1000 to 2000, this is the topic that I work on, in the course of this millennium, Europe goes from strength to strength. It starts expanding literally from the 11th century onwards and continues to this day. And as a result, the Muslims who were still part of what you call a pre-modern world and were on top of the pre-modern world, all of a sudden discover that once the rules change with modernity, they're losing. And the real wake-up call was in 1798 when Napoleon invaded. And he invaded Egypt, and he took Egypt, and he moved up the course. He was the coast towards Istanbul. He was finally stopped at Acre. But there was no question that even abroad, the French forces were infinitely stronger than anything that the Arabs could put together. And that was the beginning of an awareness that something had gone wrong. And this notion that, you know, we belong at the top of the world, but we're not. History has gone wrong. Can be very powerful. It can really be depressing. I think both the English and the French feel this. The French, I think, in my analysis, from the 11th century on, the French were sort of the leaders of the Western world. And then that was sort of taken away from them during the Industrial Revolution by the British. And both of them lost out by the end of the Second World War. And America took their place. And one of the things that you have here, and you know, France and England also are subject to the problems of honor shame, is this sense of resentment, this sense that, you know, this is no fair, I've been cheated. The success of America, or in the Muslim case, the success of the modern West, has deprived me of my greatness, and I must take vengeance. And so there's a fair level of a need for revenge on the part of the Muslims in order to restore their lost honor, their lost face. Their face has been blackened. And now the only way to wash a blackened face is through blood. So there's this enormous hostility, often can't express itself. This problem of being shamed by modernity for the Muslims reached an acute stage with Israel. Because here's this tiny people. The Jews historically have always been a people that have not fought, at least in the history of Islam, except for some of the early tribes that they fought. Jews have always been a subject people. They were a subject people in Christianity. They were a subject people in Islam. They were always at the bottom of the sort of hierarchy of groups. You know, the Greek Orthodox are at the top, and then you go down, and at the bottom of the Jews were always the lowliest, always considered cowardly and so on. And then all of a sudden, in 1948, the Arabs announced to the world that they're going to wipe out this new state, and they lose. And they lose on a massive scale. 7 Arab armies lose to a bunch of ragtag Jews who barely know how to fight. Many of them just come from the Holocaust, survivors of the Holocaust. And yet they lose on the world stage. And I would say that, the Arabs, in particular the Palestinians, often use this expression, the Nakba, the catastrophe, to refer to what happened in 1948. And generally what they mean by it, or what they intend to mean by it, is the disaster that befell the Palestinians in 1948 as a result of this war. And originally when they used that, they used it to describe the way in which Arab elites had started the war and failed the Palestinians. So initially the term Nakba was used by Palestinians to criticize the Arabs, the Arab elites. Now it's used to criticize Israel, and they say their claim is that 600,000 or 800,000 refugees were driven out of Israel by the Israelis and so on. Obviously, the historical record's more complicated than that, but that's their narrative. I think what really is going on with the Nakba is that it was an utter humiliation for the entire Arab world, including the Palestinians, and certainly for the Palestinian leadership. That it was the equivalent of somebody who considered themselves a world-class athlete being beaten by a girl. And in fact, being beaten by a girl, who was wearing high heels or something. I mean, it was a total catastrophe. And one of the ways they responded to that was to kick the Jews out of the Arab world. So the Iraqis, the Yemenis, the Taimanis, the Egyptians didn't do that. They did it in '67. But throughout the Arab world, the Syrians and so on, throughout the Arab world, all across North Africa, Jews were kicked out, and probably somewhere between 800,000 and 1 million Jews were kicked out of the Arab world. And it was an act of vengeance. It was an act of, we have been defeated, we are furious, and we will strike wherever we can. And of course, these Jewish populations were enormously vulnerable. So you have a number of pogroms, and then by and large, the Jews flee, leaving everything behind and so on. Again, it's important to understand that this issue of the humiliation of the existence of Israel has a double meaning. On the one hand, it's got this meaning that I just described, which you could argue is a sort of cultural meaning, the Jews against the Arabs, and it's a war, and the Arabs lost, and so on. But it's also a religious issue. Part of the self-image that Muslims have of themselves is that they are a religion that should dominate. And certainly it should dominate in what they consider Dar al-Islam. And Israel is right in the heart of Dar al-Islam. This has been part of the Muslim world since a generation after the Prophet died, even less than a generation. And it's always, with the exception of the Christian Crusaders for a brief period, it's always been in possession of the Muslims. And the Jews have always been dhimmi. So to have the Jews establish an autonomous state in the heart of Dar al-Islam, for there to be sovereign Jews in Dar al-Islam, is an unbelievable insult to Islam, at least to the form of Islam that believes that it must dominate. Certainly dominated Dar al-Islam, and then of course everything should be Dar al-Islam, so they should dominate. And that, I think, lies at the heart of the rejection. So I mentioned earlier the whole issue of Camp David and Yasser Arafat. Yasser Arafat could not say yes to Camp David. He could not openly acknowledge that the Jews were here to stay. He would have been giving up the last shred of Arab honor in this matter. And as he put it, when somebody once said to him, "Why didn't you say yes?" What, you want me to be drinking tea with Sadat? And that's what happened to Sadat. Sadat made peace with the Israelis, and he was assassinated. And he was assassinated by radical Muslims who, in fact, are part of the jihad that we're now dealing with today. So as a result, you've got a situation where, as far as the Muslims are concerned, it is a zero-sum conflict with Israel. There's no way that it can be resolved except by the elimination of Israel, which is itself a profound humiliation. It is a blackening of the face of Islam. It's a blasphemy against Allah, and only its disappearance can solve that. And I'm not saying there aren't Muslims who would like to say, look, let's get over this stuff and get on with our lives. And in fact, Israel can be a good neighbor, and we can acquire many things through the Israelis without going to the Europeans and so on. And there were Muslims who were saying that from the beginning of the Zionist movement. But the most violent and the most radical are the ones who must defend the honor of Islam, and in their mind, people who are Muslims who are willing to compromise are pretty much apostates. They have abandoned the true religion of Islam, and they deserve to die just as much as the Jews do. So I got to say, it's a very difficult situation. And again, to get back to this issue of cognitive egocentrism, it does not help us to find solutions to this problem by pretending that this is not the way they view things. And this is not, in particular, this is not the way their leadership views things.